It's Thursday, February 4th, and welcome to the New York Amsterdam News Podcast. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. My guest this week is Marq Claxton, who is the Director of Public Relations and Public Affairs for the Black Law Enforcement Alliance. He's going to be speaking with me about the brutal arrest and pepper spraying of a 9-year-old black girl by police in Rochester, as well as some other issues concerning law enforcement. The recent brutal arrest and pepper spraying of a 9-year-old black girl in Rochester, New York, caught on video is causing national outrage. Police body cam footage of the incident released by the Rochester Police Department is from January 29th and shows officers arresting the child while responding to a domestic call. After being handcuffed and forced into a police car, the girl is seen being pepper sprayed. One of the officers was suspended and 2 others were placed on administrative leave. And Marq Claxton is on the phone with me right now to discuss everything that's going on with this case, as well as some other issues going on in law enforcement. Welcome to the podcast, Marq. How are you?
I'm doing well, Josh.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, first, I just want to tell you and everybody else and say that you and I go back a long way. We go back almost maybe 14 years to your days when you were here in New York City. Before we get started with anything, I want you to just give us a brief background on who you are. I know that you're a former police officer, and you do a lot of stuff. You do a lot of advocacy, but you're no longer in New York, but you're somewhere else, but you're still doing the work. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
I'm Marq Claxton. I'm, as you indicated, I retired from the NYPD. I'm a retired detective, and I'm currently director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance. So I do political affairs and public relations, outreach and media work for the Black Law Enforcement Alliance. I'm a native New Yorker, now relocated in South Carolina, but still very active with issues, particularly in New York City as it relates to the police department, law enforcement in general.
All right, wonderful. I know that you have a lot of views on law enforcement still, even though you're in South Carolina, about situations that are happening, not just here in New York, but all over the country. But I do want to get your thoughts. We spoke earlier this week for an article that I did about the situation in Rochester. But what do you think about that in Rochester? We saw the tape, very graphic, very brutal, 9-year-old black girl, pepper sprayed, handcuffed, being manhandled by these officers. What are your thoughts about it?
You know, unfortunately, I'm not shocked by it from a police perspective. It's unfortunately something that we've grown too accustomed to. The police abuse, the police criminality, particularly targeting people of color. Now, more recently, targeting women as opposed to black men, which has always been the prime target, and then also targeting our younger population. So it is not shocking what the police did. It is disgusting, offensive, and they should be held accountable and fully held accountable and prosecuted to the highest extent by the criminal justice system. What angered me so much about what they did is the lack of reaction by Rochester's government, and in particular the mayor, Lovely Warren, black woman, very talented, very gifted, just sharp enough to know that she needed to do something much more than what she did. We're way past, especially with Rochester PD and their history. And I know people remember what occurred with Daniel Prude. He was and had an interaction with the police, had a mental episode with the police, and ended up dying because they placed a spit mask over him and had him positioned in a particular way that, in essence, it was asphyxiation. And after that, which took months to come forward, and it only came out because of a video that was released, and the poor police response, the poor government response. Now, months later, here we have this situation with this young lady occurring, and the mayor still very slow at the wheel, slow to respond, not responding strong enough. Listen, those police officers should have been, one, immediately terminated, and anyone who was directly involved with that assault of that young lady should have been arrested. And for that not to happen is very troubling and disappointing, and it really is an indictment, not only on the police, we're accustomed to that, but it's an indictment on the government, city government at Rochester, that black mayor and that black police chief because they failed to take the affirmative steps.
All right, I just want to reiterate that one of the officers involved has been suspended, and two others were placed on administrative leave. However, they are still on the payroll, unfortunately. I want to go back to what you said about the Rochester mayor. She
Yeah.
is saying, she did say in a statement that state law and union contracts prevent her from taking more immediate and serious action. Is that we've heard that before, and we have some issues with unions here in New York City when it comes to police officers and certain things that can and can't be done. But what's your reaction to that? Because that's her reason. She says that union contracts and state law prevent her from taking immediate and serious action. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, there are civil service laws and union regulations that make it difficult for her to act. But there are times when the mayor has an obligation, just to protect and defend the other constituents and not be primarily concerned with union regulations that limit what can be done immediately. This is a perfect example of when the mayor should say, union regulations be damned. This we have to do because it is the right thing to do. And these police officers have to be held to a higher standard. And she should have done what, Keisha Lance Bottoms did in Atlanta, over the summer, where she decided on the same day that video came out of an abusive police situation that the police officer had to be fired. And then we can deal with what happens with the union later on. And that's what she should have done in Rochester PD. And she should have done it in part because there is now a history of these type of events that are occurring in her city. And either you're going to lead, follow, or get out the way. You can't rely on the rules kind of, bind me or restrict me, etc. You have to take a stand. You have to commit to protecting and preserving the safety and security for the rest of the constituents. And sometimes you're going to butt heads with the unions. You're always, as a mayor, going to butt head with the union. But that's what has to be done. So is it a legitimate excuse? Yes, but it is just that, an excuse. She could have taken the necessary action, and she should have in this case.
All right. And I do want to talk to you about something that we discussed this week about the age of the person. We're talking about a 9-year-old child here. And during the incident, one of the officers said that you're acting like a kid, told her she was acting like a kid, and her response was, I am a kid. Again, 9-year-old child. I've said this for a long time, and I've always thought this, and it's that law enforcement sees our black children aged way faster than other children. Why is that? I mean, obviously, this 9-year-old child was being treated and manhandled and pepper sprayed like she was an adult. And you mentioned humanity this week, and I want you to talk about that. Sure. What do you mean by that? There was no humanity. Tell me about that.
It's easy to be abusive, to be brutal, to be violent. It's easy when you attribute no humanity, when you display no humanity towards that other person, when the person you're dealing with is an it or an other. And too often what has occurred is police operate without a shred or just a modicum of humanity in them. They don't relate or empathize or see their humanity in others. They don't recognize the humanity. And when that occurs, you can do all types of violent, vile, disgusting things to people, because you're not dealing with them as human beings. You're dealing with them as its and others or those or thems. And that's all too often what happens and leads to these type of abuses. You have to have a police force that at its core, at its base, recognizes and respects the humanity of individuals, because that will in itself prevent them from committing these vile, abusive acts against people. And for policing in this country, it's quite clear that when you police in black and brown communities, your humanity meter goes all the way down, because you do all types of things to those people. Why? Because you don't recognize their humanity. You don't see them as, the multidimensional human beings. they are those things in which we impose these laws upon.
Right. And of course, we have both of those videos. We have two videos that the Rochester Police Department did release of the incident on our website. One of them is a 10-minute video. The other one is a 6-minute video, 10-minute video, 6-minute video. And they're both just different angles and perspectives on the from the body cams, the footage from the body cams that the officers had on. Another issue that kind of, and by the way, those videos have both received a combined viewing of about 1 million views. Another thing that we have to talk about here is mental health. It's clear that in the videos you can tell that this young girl, I should say, or not a lady, young girl, was obviously having a mental health issue. She kept being repetitive. She kept asking for her father over and over again, which there's nothing wrong with that. But she, you could tell that there was something else going on. In fact, the call that the officers received was for family trouble, quote unquote family trouble. That's the term that's being used for why the officers were there. Right. And also that this young girl was having an issue, having some mental issues. And it goes back to the conversation of how law enforcement handles mental health calls. There have been some changes here in New York City, and even calling for more changes for a different type of response when it comes to responding to mental health crises. What are your thoughts on that? Should law enforcement be responding to mental health situations?
I think I agree with so many of the reform platforms now, and I think we have to really examine how do we incorporate mental health professionals into these situations. I think too often and for too long, we've just accepted or believed that the police were professional enough to make proper and correct calls when dealing with people who are in the midst of emotional or psychological breakdowns or episodes. And I think we're now at the point where we realize that the police just have abandoned their professional standing in regards to their response to individuals with psychological disabilities or who are experiencing these episodes. And they are relying on what they do know, and that is physicality. That's a police response now. Is not professional and comprehensive. It's all about the physicality. So I think what many jurisdictions are doing, what seems like all of the reform movements are pushing, is that we have now incorporating mental health professionals into a response, an emergency response, not to displace the police, because there are times when the police are needed in those cases, but in an effort to diffuse these situations, to prevent them from becoming out of control or exacerbating someone's, mental situation. And quite clearly, we've now decided that the police are not, able to handle these situations anymore. And in order to protect and preserve human life, it's time to bring the professionals in.
I have to point out with this situation, this was a young black girl that this happened to. The mayor of Rochester, New York, is a black woman. The interim police chief in Rochester, Cynthia Harriet Sullivan, is a black woman. And the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, is a black woman. Now, it looks like the stars might be aligned for justice, just with that lineup that I just said to you. Do you think with that lineup that I just explained, will there be justice here?
Not from the mayor of Rochester or the police chief, the acting police chief in Rochester, because they've already gone on the record like immediately and basically have been kicking the can, so to speak. They've issued statements. They have to review it. They're limited by the union. They've already begun the process of making these excuses. And then keep in mind, they have a history of not really addressing these type of issues. So, and as far as they are concerned, I don't think we're in a position to see anything significant play out. I was heartened by the response of the Attorney General. I think Letitia James immediately came in and committed to investigating some of the details of this particular incident. And I'm hopeful that will have some significant results, because Rochester government just is not in a position right now, or they've made decisions that they're going to play this as carefully as possible, that they don't want to shake any cages or rattle any cages, and so I don't see getting ultimate justice dealing with them.
All right. Have to bring it back to New York City because I know that you were a former police officer. There was another story that we did this week, rather that I did this week, about arrests not being slowed down during the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to read you some data here from the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services that was recently released, and it said that the NYPD is continuing to target low-income people of color for minor infractions. This happened in 2020. And among the findings, 87% of misdemeanor arrests involved people of color in 2020, compared to 86.5 in 2019 and 86.5 again in 2018. 288 marijuana arrests were 95% people of color, and criminal summonses for marijuana possession were 95% people of color as well. We keep seeing this over and over again. I guess even during a pandemic, the NYPD is not lightening up on us even still. I have to tell you that the city council is putting forth several bills to reform the police department. We've heard this before. More transparency, more accountability. First, what is your reaction to those numbers I just read to you? The police are arresting us more for minor infractions, and majority of the misdemeanors were arrests were black people. What do you think about that?
Well, first, I got to commend you on the excellent work that you did with that report and that story, because it's significant and it's very telling, and it's something that forces people to recognize that unless and until there is a comprehensive reform in police agencies and it's enacted, where it's actually implemented, the police are going to be the police. And those figures that you cited and those statistics that you indicated, that's standard police operations, pandemic, no pandemic, majority black city, majority white city. The police consistently engage in race-based enforcement, and that leads to race-based prosecutions, and that leads to the glaring disparity in incarceration rates. It's all interconnected, and it will happen regardless of the dynamics, regardless of the demographics. The police tend to target black and brown individuals for arrest and prosecution. And so it is significant, and I don't know how far it will go, but it is significant that the city council has come forward with the plans to redefine what public safety is and basically engage in a reform movement, so to speak, and make these recommendations. But I'm mindful that many of these recommendations are decades old, but I am hopeful that at least some of them will be implemented, because absent the implementation of significant reform, the police will be the police, and black and brown people will be target number one.
Mm-hmm. Just have to reiterate, the city council announced this week that it's introducing a legislative package of 11 bills aimed at reforming the NYPD, and among those bills are removing the police commissioner's final disciplinary authority, investigating police officers with a history of bias, reforming the role of school safety agents, and creating a non-police emergency response for mental health emergencies. So that's just kind of a tip of the iceberg of some of those 11 bills that are being discussed, and there will be some hearings happening later on this month. I know that I'm definitely going to be covering that and watching those hearings to see what we get out of it. Have to talk to you now about the Capitol insurrection. We did see one of the Capitol police officers laid to rest yesterday, and it's interesting now that it's been almost a month since that happened. It happened on January 6th. Here we are on February 4th, and we're still seeing arrests. We're still seeing the aftermath of this, the effects of this. It was just so awful. From a law enforcement perspective, what did you think about that? And is what's going on now with these arrests, and maybe even jail time for a lot of these people, could be ahead for them. Is it justified? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that it's woefully inadequate what's been done to bring to justice these insurrection terrorists. And those people who they have identified and have even arrested have been grossly undercharged. And here's why. And this should tell you that something is not quite right. Those individuals, in some shape or form, who were arrested, were engaged in a course of criminal conduct. In conjunction with other people also engaged in a course of criminal conduct. And during the course of that criminal conduct, people died, people were killed. And one of those people being a police officer. Under normal circumstances, those people will be charged with the equivalent of acting in concert to the homicide, to the murder, or they will be charged in a way that clearly indicates that their behavior contributed to the death of that individual or that police officer. For some reason, these people are being charged with the equivalent of trespass, a kind of group trespass, but not the most serious charges that they could be charged with, and it's my position they should have been charged with. Why? Well, we're talking about white people being charged, and it's an inadequate process. So they're all being undercharged because they're not being charged in any way connected to the deaths that occurred there, not only the police officer, but even one of the protesters' death. And they should be. And that's why they're being allowed to bail out and return and they want special exemptions and exceptions and process. This is really a display in pure privilege and how serious they take it when the terrorists, when the insurrectionists are not people of color. You see, we wouldn't engage in this type of behavior, and if we ever did, we'd be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. These people are getting away with crimes, and unfortunately, and this rarely happens, you have a police officer laid to rest, and there is not a single arrest or the identification of a single perpetrator when there were hundreds of people in the Capitol on that day. That's rare. I'm telling you that this investigation is not being handled appropriately and properly, and that the few people who they decided to arrest, they're undercharging, and now they're engaged in conversation as to whether they should continue to arrest people. Absolutely disgusting and unacceptable.
All right. Well, listen, it was such a pleasure to speak with you, Marq. It's been such a long time. I'm so glad to talk to you about these things. Definitely want to have you back on the podcast for another episode as we move forward with more things happening in law enforcement. But again, as always, we appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to a return.
All right. Thank you. That concludes this week's podcast. You can pick up the latest edition of the New York Amsterdam News on newsstands and get updates online at amsterdamnews.com. You can also keep up with us on Facebook at NY Amsterdam News and follow us on Twitter at NYAmNews. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. Thanks for listening.